A 29-year-old man, protagonist, was expelled from his family home at 22 after his sister Hannah falsely accused him of facilitating her husband's affair. Years later, after rebuilding his life and getting engaged, he receives anonymous evidence from the ex-husband Pete, proving Hannah was the cheater and that she framed him. He and Pete confront Hannah and their parents. Hannah is expelled and turns to him for help. He refuses, embraces his fiancée Liza as family, blocks and legally distances himself, and declares he'll only communicate via lawyers from now on. The day the house decided him disposable, Light was something to step around. He sat on the bottom stair with a single backpack at his feet while the house moved upstairs, voices muffled, the boom of plates, the shuffle of loyalties building one stair at a time. Hannah's cry had sounded like glass. It had the wrong pitch, too loud in a place that used to hold quiet family jokes. When she named him, it landed like an accusation on a tile floor, blunt, final, impossible to ignore. He remembered every small thing about that morning, the hallway wallpaper, the smell of lemon oil on the console table, the way his mother's face went paper white. His father's hand found the banister as if the wood itself might steady him while he threw away his son. "You brought this into our home," his mother said, not to Hannah, not to the husband she cried for, but to him. No questions. No investigation. The word disgusted burned across the table like a folded napkin. He was 22. He worked retail, learned how to fold sweatshirts into neat, patient rectangles to keep his hours unchanged. He'd been saving because leaving was still a plan, a future unity of rent and bills and something like dignity. There hadn't been time to finish plans. There had only been a thunderbolt of accusation and the way a home can become a place that suddenly has no use for you. Outside, the sidewalk held the chill of a late spring rain the house would never see. He sat and cried until his throat was raw, and the neighbor from across the street, a woman who kept a neat row of potted succulents, offered him tea and a couch for the night. Pride was an article of clothing he no longer wore. He took the tea. Hannah had always been the bright room. 7 years older, polished and practiced at warmth. She sang at family dinners, wore her opinions like jewelry, and had friends who came with good references and louder smiles. He had been the appendix in the body of the family, there, technically useful but never expected to be admired. The age gap was a small cruelty in itself. She had a marriage and a household. He had the long gray afternoons in the living room reading manuals for things he barely knew how to fix. After the door closed on him, the house became a museum of accusations. Their mother clipped photos into frames and kept them like evidence of a life that still made sense. He didn't understand how words could rearrange memory. He only knew that truths could be stolen by someone you trusted. At the grocery where he worked, customers asked him how his family was. He lied and said they were fine. Later that night, in a cheap rented room, he lay awake and made a list of things that hurt more than hunger: being uninvited from your childhood bedroom, the sound of someone telling a lie that makes your bones hollow, the absence of the small mercies parents give without thinking. But grief is not a permanent home. It teaches you to pack slowly. The slow work of living begins with small profits, a steady paycheck, a couch that becomes his, friendships lit by shared pizza, and the kind of jokes that do not require family history. He learned how to breathe in rooms that did not belong to him. Still, when his fingers brushed the screen of his phone and saw Hannah's face in a photograph, something cold and brittle folded inside his chest. He would later name this survival, the thin, clean edge of a man who had been made to leave and had taught himself how to stand again. But that day, the backpack at his feet, he simply learned to count the cost of being unwanted. He traded the shame of that eviction for a job that chewed up afternoons and spat out paychecks. He learned the city's rhythms, the subway's first sigh each morning, the tiny fish market behind the deli where fishmongers argued about the weather, the woman on the corner who sold secondhand books and knew which volumes made him more honest with himself. Work was rhythm. The rhythm kept his hands busy and his thoughts from making a home in the old Betrayal. Liza found him where people find one another now, a conference room, a stray laugh over a coffee urn. She was intentional, a doctor who could sketch a life in tidy subheadings. She laughed the way someone who understands pain can do, not to dismiss it, but to put pieces in order. In 5 months it was obvious. In a year, domesticity crept in, a shared grocery list, someone to leave sock-shaped prints of affection on the floor, a photograph that looked like an ordinary marriage could exist without ancient scandal. He loved Liza for small practical things, how she made appointments with the calm of someone who had scheduled storms before, how she read texts aloud when he fell asleep, how she refused to explain his absence with pity. She became quiet witness and bright shield. Their engagement was a photograph he would later put in a drawer for rainy days, 2 faces lit by a restaurant candle, smiles that were choices rather than reactions. The universe, he learned, enjoys irony. One of the engagement photos made a modest tilt across social feeds and into the sphere where people she knew might also sit, and there, by way of a mutual past seminar connection, Pete saw it. Pete's contact was a ghost from a chapter that had been locked away. He'd once been married to Hannah, a catalog of small mercies, and then a fissure that made everyone pick sides. Pete's life had been carefully rebuilt from the wreckage of that marriage. When he saw the engagement post, something moved him, not to rekindle a romance, but to right an old wrong. He wrote an anonymous email first, because embarrassment had swaddled him for years. He'd been a man made timid by public pain, reaching out in secret felt safe. The message was sharp and surgical, attachments, screenshots, the syntax of proof. He did not expect rejoicing, only an opportunity to tell someone whose life had been bent that the archive of truth existed. When the file opened on his phone, his first sensation was not triumph but vertigo. Names, timestamps, the tilted candidness of someone who believed they were private when they were the least private of all. The emails between Hannah and Frank were not flirtatious notes, but drafted plans of meetings and coded approvals, small admissions signed with the minor's signature of a middle name he had never heard his sister use. The documents were meticulous, a timeline that taught him how to reconstruct the old morning when the house had set him outside. He spent a night reading the messages like a man who reads a map to find a missing city. The anger that rose was precise. It had edges. It was not a wild thing that wanted immediate ruin. It cataloged injustice and weighed consequences. Pete, embarrassed and eager to do the right thing, proposed a quiet meeting. He wanted to stand somewhere honest with him and say, "I am sorry I couldn't speak then." Meeting Pete in the small cafe near his job was like holding a brittle photograph. Pete was thinner, with lines carved where once there had been only laughter and a life he assumed would remain. He admitted the same thing most people admit when guilt sits on their chest. It took courage to see the truth and cowardice to not say it sooner. He wanted to help now, if only to fix an imbalance he'd watched from the wrong side. They found in each other not only a shared past, but a way to correct it. Pete let him have the documents first. "I sent the email," he said, voiced the color of someone who had slept poorly for years. "I don't want credit. I only want the truth to be known." The angle of retribution that first formed in his mind was not just to humiliate, it was to compel an answer. There was something steadier he wanted, recognition, apology, a measure of reparation that had the dignity of being earned. For the first time since the eviction, the idea of walking back into the house that had once shut its doors felt possible, not as a plea but as a carefully prepared act of unveiling. The plan they began to outline was not only tactical, it was a moral arithmetic of wounds. He rehearsed what he would say like a man rehearsing an opera piece. The city hummed outside, as if it had no idea a long dormant ledger was opening. What he hadn't expected was how little triumph would settle into his chest when they first walked up the family path. They arrived unannounced, 2 bearing evidence and 1 bearing a strange stillness that could be mistaken for peace. His palms were slightly damp beneath his jacket. Pete held a thin manila envelope like a relic. The house looked smaller from the outside than in his memory, as if his absence had shrunk the rooms by rearranging the light. When his mother opened the door and saw him, the expression was initial disbelief that seemed to recalibrate the world around her. Hannah fled the room as if sound could protect her. That small flinch, the staccato of escape, suggested what he already knew. She had intended to avoid this encounter because she had to. The documents came out like a surgeon's tools, timestamps, email chains, and a signature he'd never seen in a formal context but would never forget again. Her middle name, a private sign-off she'd used when she thought she was only writing for a lover. His father's first instinct was to bluff, to pretend that truth was negotiable. "Where did you get these?" he demanded, not because he didn't know, but because asking the question is a ritual that buys time and softens a blow. His mother looked as if she held a fever, and also the remnants of a faith that had been too easily misplaced. Hannah tried to rewrite the scene with the breathless audacity of someone who has been believed too often. She attempted the old lines, misconstrued messages, a momentary lapse, regret. The files said otherwise. She tried to call the emails fabricated, but the evidence contained the GPS notes of meetings, the shorthand nobody would invent, the small mundane entries that betray intimacy, the coffee shop whose name she'd misspelled in conversation. The inside joke repeated in a way only two accomplices would mimic. When his father finally read the emails, the room condensed into the hard salt of a single moment. The father's face moved through horror, then shame, then the smallest, strangled apology that might never reach him. We should have, his father started, an admission that arrived 7 years too late to reorder nights of humiliation and years of fixes. It should have felt like triumph. Instead, what came was a strange, almost foreign emotion, a thread of sorrow for how easily love had turned to allegiance. The family portrait on the wall, once an arrangement of smiles, now looked like a stage thing in which faces had learned how to lie in unison. When his father reached for Hannah, it was something like instinct. They are a parent and child. Loyalty gets reflexive muscles. The reflex snapped when the father realized the arithmetic of being shown a thing you'd refused to see for years. He moved in a way that suggested a man working out a moral algebra, landing on a punishment he could not rescind. They moved fast after that, but it was not chaos. It was the deliberate, judicial slow pace of someone who finally recognized a wrong and wanted to balance the scales. The father packed Hannah's belongings like an accountant balancing ledgers. There was no ceremony. No loud doors slam like in movies. Just the dull sound of suitcases sliding across hardwood, an ordinary sound rendered strange by the fact it was Hannah, not him, leaving. Yet even as they watched her go, something gnawed at him. Power reversed could still feel like power. He had prepared himself for a cinematic vindication, the shocked faces, the tears, the apology. For a minute it nearly arrived. But in the hollow that followed the drama, he noticed a different thing, the legalities of aftermath. Hannah left with a chance to write letters, to seek shelter, his parents left with questions that could not be questions alone. And he was left with the knowledge that exposing a lie would not restore the years taken, nor would it fill the small emptiness where family used to be without arguing about it. Hannah's exit was punctuated by something that felt like a twist in a well-worn story. She turned once toward him before the door closed, and her eyes held no hatred, only a desperate, naked pleading. For a breath he considered her as the little girl who'd once been coaxed onto a lap for a crooked lullaby, not the architect of his exile. But the thought passed like a wind. Betrayal reorders even the memory of the child. In the foyer's new quiet, his father's hand trembled. There was a pulse of apology, not directed at him but at what they had all lost. The midpoint had not produced the catharsis he had rehearsed. It delivered instead the complex currency of truth, expensive, heavy, and not necessarily redemptive. The days after were quieter than he expected. The world didn't immediately rearrange to reflect the scale of the revelation. At home, Liza made coffee in the mornings with the patience of someone who knows how to hold a life together. For him, the house was a sanctuary and an evidence locker both. He mounted a copy of the emails into a folder and kept it under the sink like a talisman. The exchange at his parents' house had been a correction rather than catharsis. It had exposed the wound but not healed the scab. Hannah apparently tried everything. She called. She texted. She stood belatedly at the foot of the door like someone who had misread the map of her own life. There were occasional visits to his workplace, attempts to intercept him on the street, and messages full of pleading grammar and pointed absences that begged for sympathy. Each contact was a reminder that truth could be messier than a neat courtroom. It demanded that you decide how far compassion would reach. He considered contacting his parents. He considered a long letter, an apology he wasn't sure he could stomach, because truth had a weight that invited either reconciliation or finality. He had imagined a family that, seeing proof, would hold him and ask for forgiveness. Instead, his parents' call for reconciliation smacked of convenience. They wanted to be present in the life he had rebuilt, to fan the flame of family again now that the facts favored him. The audacity of that request stung more than Hannah's brash pleas. Legally, Pete had been useful beyond delivering receipts. He had been willing to testify to what he'd learned, to stand somewhere near him when the world demanded concrete proof. The two of them started mapping the fallout, how to protect themselves from harassment, whether to involve lawyers preemptively, how to ensure that a person who had once weaponized falsehood would not weaponize public sympathy. Pete's hands trembled at the outline of it. He wanted justice, but also feared that dramatizing everything would ruin himself in the process. One night, a voicemail from his father collapsed the gap between them in the wrong way. "We take things back," the voice said. "We've been foolish. Come home." The cadence suggested a man ready to resume a role he'd abandoned when fear eclipsed reason. The message was not accompanied by apology. It was an offer. The family would step back into position, resume the rituals of holidays and birth announcements, and yet there was no accounting of the long years of exile. Liza listened to the voicemails with a dispassionate tenderness that impressed him. "They want the inheritance of connection without paying the price," she said. Her mouth formed the words in the way of someone preparing a legal brief. "You have to decide if you want them in your wedding picture, or if you want an honest picture of what family looks like now." He began to feel something cold and precise take shape: boundaries. He thought of the sidewalk that had swallowed him 7 years ago, and how easily it had been when people were asked to choose between a daughter and a son. He imagined a house where his fiancé's hands were the ones that arranged the plates. He thought of the safety that comes with chosen family, those who show up without ledgering every kindness. But the building pressure was not only internal. Hannah's harassment escalated into something that felt like stalking, appearing in the parking lot of his work, sending messages in the weekend hours, using friends to try to reach him. He responded with silence until silence was no longer safe. The legal options loomed like architecture he'd rather not inhabit but would if necessary: protection orders, police reports, the slow grind of litigation. In the end, the choice before him was not simple revenge. It asked for a moral calculus. Should he turn out the light on a past that had wronged him, or should he make a public accounting so no one else could suffer the same betrayal? He was haunted by the same question that had followed him since the eviction: if you prove you were right, who has to carry the proof? The answer, painfully, felt like everyone. So they prepared. Pete and he spoke to a lawyer about harassment parameters and restraint processes. Liza learned how to document voicemails. He rehearsed boundaries in the mirror: calm voice, no engagement, insistence on legal channels. The preparation felt like armor more than revenge, a construct meant to keep him inside the life he had rebuilt and to prevent the old house from becoming an instrument of renewed suffering. When Hannah finally staged the dramatic car hood collapse in front of his apartment, a melodrama that made neighbors call the police, the stage had already been set. He would not be undone a second time. He had learned to catalog pain and to let it inform measured responses. The inevitability of the police's arrival felt like closure in the manner of a necessary step, the law, in this case, a tool for preserving his peace. She threw herself across the hood of his car as if performance could force his gaze. It was early morning, the pavement still holding last night's rain. His keys were in his hand, and the day was beginning the ordinary way: goodbye, kiss, lock the door, drive. Hannah's body on the hood was loud and immediate, a single punctuation that made neighbors come out and watch with that slow, voyeuristic compassion reserved for family fights. She looked less like a woman seeking help and more like someone trying to reclaim an audience. He could see the old Hannah, the practiced singer of sorrow whose cries had filled rooms like perfume. Her face was red, mascara streaks cutting dark lines down her cheeks, an expression he had once mistaken for sincerity. "Please," she called, voice raw and shredding like cloth. "Just listen. Just don't do this." The crowd thickened. Someone dialed. A neighbor from 2 doors down stood with phone raised, ready to do whatever bystander ritual felt like it would help. He listened to her pleadings and felt nothing that resembled pity. He felt the weight of surveillance. He felt the years rewind and then drop him again, not into humiliation but into a careful, merciless clarity. For 7 years he had rehearsed not this moment, but the one that came next, the one where he no longer allowed himself to be someone's scapegoat. She reached for him, the motion of someone who had been allowed the safety of being carried for too long. His hands were steady. Liza, watching from the doorway, pressed her thumb against the inside of his wrist, a small, human semaphore that meant, "We are together." He heard himself say words he'd never have imagined his voice making. "Hannah, get up. You need to stop." When she refused, the minutes rearranged into procedure. He called the police because there was no other tool left that would protect his life from chaos that had been normalized. Officers arrived with the businesslike compassion of people who see this play often. They spoke calmly to Hannah and gently warned her about trespassing and harassment. She shrieked that he was cruel, that everyone owed her a roof and a family. The officers did what officers do. They asked for identification. They took notes. They explained next steps. Someone knocked on his neighbor's door to offer an eyewitness statement. The act of documentation, oddly, felt like worship, an invocation of the civic rituals that could make lies costly. When the police drove Hannah away, she turned at the car window and screamed something that sounded like apology and accusation braided together. It would become one of those lines that could be quoted out of context in later conversations. "You are the monster," she wailed, and in that accusation was the old power play, make the injured party perform the role of villain and watch the world tilt. But the climax's true beat happened later, in the quiet after the siren and the slam of doors. At home, he sat with Liza while the city hummed beyond the walls. The legal papers were filed the next day, protection orders, harassment complaints, the mechanical steps of someone deciding the shape their boundaries would take. There was a strange moral clarity in those forms, a paper that read like a decision and felt like a verdict. He had not sought to ruin a life for the taste of revenge. He had sought a life where he wasn't perpetually being baited into drama. His mother called and asked for a meeting. The voice on the other end had the brittle quality of someone who had swallowed shame and complicated it with plans for restoration. "We took her back," she said, as if that absolved a list of omissions. He thought of his father, scanning the news for reasons, composing explanations that would allow him to sleep. He thought of the way the house had become a theater where loyalty had been assumed a priori. When his parents announced they wanted to come back into his life, to attend the wedding, to mend stitches, his answer needed to be both simple and final. He typed, "No. Not now. And not unless there is accountability." He did not write vitriol. He wrote a boundary. It was a sentence that asked them to do the hard thing if they wanted to be invited back. It was also a sentence that refused to erase the past. The climax left him with a strange residue, relief mixed with the sourness of loss. Hannah, removed from the house that had once protected her selfishness, became an exile of a different sort. She had to rent, to reorder her finances, to stand at school holiday tables without the automatic advocate of parental shelter. He felt no glee at this. He felt confirmation. Truth can change who sleeps in which bed, but it cannot recover the years that were stolen. He closed the folder of emails and slid it under a sink, as if placing the evidence back into a kind of domestic normality. The city went on. People went to work. Neighbors returned to their lawns. He returned to his life with Liza at his side, the decision a hinge that would not easily swing back. The climax had been dramatic, public, messy, and necessary. They sent a formal invitation list to his parents later that week, not an olive branch, but a practical measure. The choice to exclude someone is an act of authorship, It writes the narrative of your life as much as any reconciliation does. They left a space for accountability. If his parents wanted to be present, they would have to ask, truly ask, and answer questions they had neglected for 7 years. That invitation was not given in public fanfare. It was a quiet fence post with legal language and clear expectations. Hannah tried again in whispers and in shouts. She would show up at work days later and stand on the sidewalk while he took out the trash, holding a paper cup like a prop for pity. Sometimes she would send letters that smelled faintly of the perfume he remembered from the living room, but now felt like a costume. She called friends to mediate. She tried to barter memories in exchange for forgiveness. Her pleas fell into the slates of a life that had learned to be fortified. At night he sometimes dreamed of the house. Not the shameful rooms, but their small peculiarities. The way sunlight carved the living room rug in winter, his mother humming in the kitchen, his father's old radio playing the songs he hated and then loved. Memory was a thief that could filch tenderness even from betrayal. He missed certain small comforts, a hand on his shoulder at a family barbecue, the private language of inside jokes, and he told himself that missing did not require forgiving. Wedding planning became the locus of a different life. Liza and he made decisions colored by their pasts, intimate guest lists, a ceremony that focused more on witnesses than tradition, a rehearsal dinner that was as much a mutual pledge as a party. They chose a small venue with big windows and a backyard the color of summer. Their vows were private things written in speechless nights. When they married, his mother's name was not on the front row. Someone asked once if it had been difficult, the decision to exclude, and he said something he would later recognize as his own truth. It hurt, but not as much as the silence that came after the accusation. Months later, a quiet legal closure arrived in the mail, a final note from the court acknowledging the harassment complaint and the restraining order. It did not erase Hannah's past or the damage done, but legally it carved a boundary. She could no longer follow, text, or approach within a designated distance. The order felt like a hinge closing. It was cold, necessary, and procedural. He exhaled in a world with rules again. In rare moments, he considered forgiveness. He wondered if the human heart could hold contradictory things at once, to love and refuse to allow harm, to grieve and choose not to reconcile. He spoke with a therapist a few times and learned to give words to the complicated ledger inside him: unjust exile, humiliation, the corrosive calm of being disbelieved, and then the hard reclaiming of agency. The therapist did not offer prescriptions, only questions. Who are you when family is unmade? What do you want your story to do now? Ultimately, he wanted a life that did not run on old hurts. He wanted to be a man who could be present for his future children without the echo of a door slammed years ago. He wanted to be a husband who could place trust where it deserved to be placed and, when necessary, protect the fragile domestic sphere he had built. On the anniversary of his eviction, he and Liza walked by the old house at dusk. The windows were dim, curtains drawn, and a single light in the upstairs room blinked like a candle that had been left on in absent-mindedness. He felt a small prickle in his throat, and then an even smaller easing. The city moved, lives rearranged. Families changed their shapes. He unfriended his parents on social media. He blocked numbers and archived old messages into folders nobody would open. He did not gloat. He was not the man who needed public victory. He had chosen a partner who would wake with him and check the locks and make coffee. That, he realized, was a different kind of home, one you built tenderly, with consent and care. Letters would come now and then, flares that sought reconciliation, pleas for pity, legal threats thin as paper. He archived most. For those that mattered, if his parents ever truly asked, not for convenience, but for accountability, he left an open, procedural door: apology, restitution, therapy, willingness to be subject to slow rebuilding. He wanted evidence of change, not just words. In the end, what he had done was not so much to ruin his sister's life as to refuse to be haunted by it any longer. He reclaimed his narrative. He loved a woman who loved him back. He kept a folder under the sink and a ring on his finger, and he learned the quiet difference between being blood-tied and being family. Outside, the night took its breath. Inside, he put his hand in Liza's, and they walked home.